Welcome to All About Agatha, the podcast dedicated to reading and ranking every single mystery novel written by the Queen of Crime, Dame Agatha Christie. I'm Catherine Brobeck.
And I'm Kemper Donovan.
And this week, we are going with Hercule Poirot to the dentist in 1-2 Buckle My Shoe.
Oh boy, to the dentist we go.
And to many a plot twist.
Yes, quite a twisty-turny trip to the dentist we shall be taking.
Just what everyone always wants to hear when they go to the dentist.
Yeah, that is going to be particularly tricky. Mm-hmm. So, a little on the publication history here. This book was first published in the UK in November of 1940. It was published the following year in February in the US under, of course, a different title. That title being The Patriotic Murders. And then it was later published in the U.S. under yet another title, An Overdose of Death. All three of those titles to me sound like they are for very different books.
Also, I mean, in keeping with a lot of the U.S. titles, the U.S. title is a little bit of a giveaway.
Do you mean An Overdose of Death or The Patriotic Murders?
Well, both of them, but I mean the Patriotic Murders insofar as we were talking about them. Well, give away a motivation in the title.
And it's a little bit of a misdirect, too. It's a little unfair. Like, you could argue it's giving it away or even argue that it's leading the reader astray.
Well, right.
I think those are terrible alternate titles, but I also have a lot of issues with the original UK title, 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, and the whole nursery rhyme framing. But we will get to that. Just one other thing of note, this is the first novel that Christie wrote during World War II. Sad Cypress, she wrote, of course it was published during World War II, but she wrote it just before the start of the war. So this is the first one she wrote in wartime, and boy, can you tell.
Right.
It has a much darker feel to it, but we will also get into that. Let's talk about our victims.
We have Henry Morley, dentist extraordinaire. He seems to have offed himself via a gunshot to the head in his own offices, in between patients at that.
On a very busy day.
Yes.
Next, we have Mr. Embaryatis, who is a potentially shady Greek spy and blackmailer who dies of an overdose of anesthesia in his hotel after his dental appointment.
Then we have Mabel Sainsbury Seal, who's a do-gooder just back from India. She goes missing, only to also be found deceased.
Okay, so suspects. We have a lot of them because it is pretty much everyone who is in that dentist's office that we visit on that oh-so-busy morning and early afternoon. First up is, of course, Morley himself. He is a suspect both in his own suicide and in the death of Embaryatis, a very obvious suspect for both of those deaths.
Right. Then we have Mabel Sainsbury Seal herself as well, because she easily could have had a role in the death of both of the men. And she'd also been seen, we'll get there, with Embaryatis before.
Next up, Alistair Blunt, who was at the dentist that morning, and he is the financial linchpin of the British banking system, bigwig in British finance.
Right. And then we have Howard Rakes, who's an American leftist. He's also at the dentist. And he is in love with none other than Jane Oliveira, who is Blunt's niece. And she's not at the dentist, but she has been there before. She's familiar with the office enough to know details about it.
Next up, we've got Agnes Fletcher, who is Morley's maid, also, of course, in the building because Morley actually lives above his own offices, which is why we also have as a suspect Georgina Morley, a.k.a. the Grenadier. She is Morley's spinster sister who also lives in the building and reminded me a little bit of Caroline Shepard of Roger Ackroyd fame.
Right.
We should also mention Dr. Riley, who is Dr. Morley's partner in dentistry. He was also working in the office that day, so he was very much on the premises. He is also Irish and sharp-tongued and possibly an alcoholic, so that is certainly suspicious. And who was our last suspect?
Oh, Frank Carter, who may or may not have been in the building, but he turns out to be a fascist, but a fascist in love with Gladys, who is Morley's secretary. And Morley disapproves of Frank, and Frank has probably shown up to confront him. How about that?
And we'll get there, but we mentioned Gladys, the secretary, but she is not actually there the day of the murders, which is why she is not on this suspect list.
There's also a new young gentleman in the office, but let's just say he's not at any point a suspect.
Oh, yes, Alfred is the boy who sort of brings people in and shows them up and down, but we'll just take him out of the running right now, even though he is kind of in the running. ostensibly in a very minor way.
In a minor way.
Listeners to this podcast will appreciate that I wanted his name to be Albert. His name is Alfred because he is essentially the exact same character as Albert in The Secret Adversary and Partners in Crime,
right?
In the Tommy and Tuppence world. I thought it would have been nice if he was a crossover character. He's written exactly the same way.
I know, and he also takes up the mantle of reading other detective novels.
Yeah. It's basically the same character. It's just that his name isn't the same. I really wanted his name to be the same. That would have been an improvement. All right. Well, let's talk about the world as it appears to be. And I think, as you can tell, this is a really complicated plot and puzzle mystery of Christie's. John Curran actually says it's her most complicated. There's just going to be a lot of incident that we have to get through for this all to make sense. So bear with us.
If it even makes sense, we'll also...
Yeah, that's a valid caveat, if it even ultimately makes sense. So we will try to get through this mess of incident as quickly and cleanly as we can. Bear with us here. All right. Poirot goes to the dentist, which is actually delightful. This is a delightful opening to the novel. He is a bit of a coward when it comes to the dentist, as so many of us are.
I raise my hand.
It's a relatively normal dentist visit. It's not so bad. The dentist Morley seems to be in a pretty decent mood. And on leaving the office, and here's the key scene, he nearly runs into Mabel Sainsbury Seal, who has a neat ankle covered with a, quote, quite good quality stocking. But sadly for Poirot, leg/ankle man that he is, and this is mentioned several times in this novel, this promising beginning ends in a brand new and rather ugly pair of buckled shoes. As Poirot says, not chic, very provincial. Alas, one of these offensive buckles falls off when the lady stumbles, and Poirot picks it up for her before cheerily heading home. He's done with the dentist, and he doesn't have to come back for 6 whole months. Yay!
I know, and my favorite detail is the cab driver seems to think he's drunk.
He's that euphoric.
Yes. So later in the day, while he's sort of joyfully at home, he gets a call from our dear friend, Inspector Japp.
Yay!
Except Inspector Japp regrets to inform him that his dentist was just found shot in the head. It looks like a suicide, but it seems inherently suspicious. And also, of course, when they saw Poirot's name in the registry, that also just adds another element to this that would cause Japp to call him. So he invites Poirot over to investigate, as is his wont. And the two men immediately both feel that something is awry, and that there's a very decent possibility that the body has been dragged into the dentist study. There are some marks on the carpet that seem telling. And also, it seems just odd that this man would have shot himself in between patients. You know, like, the root canal couldn't have gone that badly, and he wasn't the one getting it.
Right. He was also not even known to own a gun, which is a piece of information they actually get from Georgina Morley, who is the deceased dentist's sister. Georgina, just can't believe that he killed himself. This is when they also discover that the receptionist, Gladys Neville, had been mysteriously called away that morning due to a relative supposedly being sick, and that turned out to be not true at all. So she was clearly gotten away on false pretenses. We also learned that her beau, Frank Carter, was angry at Morley for disapproving of the fact that he was a literal fascist.
Yeah, also unemployed, which might be to Morley, that might be the greater sin. It's unclear.
Right. As they begin to investigate the people who were in the dentist's office that morning, the biggest fish to fry there is Alistair Blunt, who essentially runs the entire British banking system, but he, as a person, is quite mild-mannered and nondescript, and he's the reason that our dear Inspector Japp is even on this case instead of someone lower level, because Blunt has been the target of a number of death threats and attacks, mostly by radicals, very recently, i.e., perhaps the dentist was murdered, but it was Alistair Blunt who actually should have been murdered.
Right.
Alistair Blunt is portrayed as the intended victim pretty much from the get-go within this novel.
So they follow up by interviewing Mabel Sainsbury Seal, and she's this sort of dowdy blowhard of a woman. She really has nothing to tell them, but she does choose to talk at great length about herself, about her travels, about her charity work in India, and then she expounds for several pages, in fact, on her past in amateur theatrics.
What did you say? Is she an actor?
Oh, she might have been an actor.
Intruder alert! Intruder alert! Intruder alert!
So that is Mabel Sainsbury Seal. Also on this list of great interest is this Greek man, Amberiotis, who had a dental appointment right around the same time as all these other people. But when Japp and Poirot go to interview him at the Savoy, he is already dead. And it turns out that Amberiotis had been poisoned by an overdose of anesthetic injected into his gums, which, combined with an underlying heart condition, led to his death soon thereafter at the hotel. And given it would have to be Morley himself who injected that anesthetic during the dental procedure, Scotland Yard actually reverts to the initial suicide theory, suggesting that Morley realized what he had done during the Amberiotis appointment, and he then killed himself because he knew what was going to happen and he would be ruined. So, as they put it, the two deaths wash out.
Except, while all of this is going on, Miss Sainsbury Seal she's disappeared. She's gone out of her hotel after Poirot and Japp interviewed her, and she made a big point about saying how she'd be back for the dinner service, but she never returned. All that's known is that she'd been en route to see an old friend, Mrs. Chapman, who'd recently moved to London and who she'd visited before. Mrs. Chapman is also rumored by the neighbors to be the wife of Albert Chapman, who himself is rumored to be the false identity of a very famous and potentially dangerous British spy. It also turns out that Mabel Sainsbury Seal had not only been on the same voyage to England as Amberiotis, but she had previously been seen dining with him at the Savoy. Poirot goes to the hotel, and what does he find, Kemper?
Well, while searching through her room, Poirot notes that Miss Sainsbury Seal takes a 10-inch stocking and that the stocking in question is cheap. And I'm quoting Poirot here, probably 2 and 11. Okay, Poirot, like he knows the actual pricing of the stocking. And Japp even says, we're not doing probate here, old boy. But again, Poirot, leg/ankle man. And if we remember from Cards on the Table, when he bought, I believe, 20 pairs of stockings and used them in his investigations, the man knows his way around a lady's stocking.
Well, I mean, you would think that all that time on the ABC murders would have also taught him some lessons about the quality and the material of stockings as well.
Oh, stockings, yes, this is true. So besides the curious passage about the stockings, which we should take note of, he also notes that there are shoes of 2 different sizes in Miss Sainsbury Seal's room. Specifically, the evening shoes are a size smaller than the day ones, which he thinks to himself may be due either to corns or vanity. I suppose since a lady with a larger shoe size would like to pretend that her shoes are not quite as big as they actually are. That seems odd, though, certainly to me. And I think it even seems odd to Poirot because he clocks it and he moves on, but it's definitely bizarre. We never do learn the actual sizes of those differently sized shoes, by the way. He just notes that there are 2 different sizes.
As many a woman who has been to a sample sale could tell you, it is possible to see something that you really very much would like to buy and realize that it's not quite the right size, but you're determined to buy it anyway. So it is entirely conceivable that the evening shoes were like a good deal and they didn't quite have the right size.
Yeah. All right. What happens next, Catherine?
The investigation is basically over, but Poirot naturally disagrees. So contrary to what Japp wants, he decides to continue on his own. And he's insisted in this by virtue of 2 pretty big factors. There's another patient who is not a suspect really at all, but who Poirot goes to talk to. And it's a Mr. Barnes.
Right. He was in the dentist that morning as well, right?
He was.
Again, very busy day.
Very, very busy day. And Mr. Barnes is very keen on nudging Poirot into an investigation about the spy stuff, in large part because he's a boring bureaucrat in the Home Office. But he's in spitting distance of spycraft, and he thinks that Amberiotis must have been wrapped up in something bigger, and there was not a coincidence involved that Amberiotis and Alistair Blunt were in the office within like an hour of each other. That's not possible. That was a coincidence. And he is really the one who is pushing Poirot to look deeper into that. And what's the second reason, Kemper?
Related to theories of international intrigue, it turns out that Jane Oliveira insists on summoning them to her uncle's house. Again, she is the niece of Alistair Blunt, because she actually recognized Miss Sainsbury Seal, who now is, of course, missing, as a woman that had previously run into her and her uncle outside of Morley's office, and who absolutely insisted that she knew Alistair Blunt's wife. And we've been told at this point that Alistair Blunt's wife is the late financial heiress, Rebecca Arnholt. Blunt said to Miss Sainsbury Seal, again, this is Jane Oliveira reporting all of this, Blunt said that he doubted that was possible, but Miss Sainsbury Seal remained quite insistent. And Jane just found the whole exchange rather odd. We also, in the course of this conversation, learned that Jane's secret paramour, Howard Rakes, the radical leftist, is at odds with Blunt just in a political way, because he wants to bring the British financial system down. He wants it to crash and burn because he wants to start over and build a better society.
Right. He's not exactly labeled in the book as like a radical communist.
Right.
He's some part of a far leftist move. He's advocating for a kind of anarchy.
We've talked about this stock character in Christie before, the well-meaning radical leftist young man who might have some crazy views but often has his heart in the right place. And I found him to be somewhat that character. I think he's portrayed as a little bit more dangerous than that, especially because it's hard not to think of him as the counterpart to Frank Carter, who is absolutely portrayed as dangerous, and they're just on opposite ends of the political spectrum.
Rakes and Carter are parallels with each other in that they believe in the downfall of the British banking system and
the status quo, even more broadly.
Yeah.
That is portrayed as a very dangerous thing in this book.
Well, right, and we know that Blunt and Jane's mother really, really do not want her even associated with Rakes. That's how far out of society they think he is. Okay. So in the midst of that, there's a very clever younger Scotland Yard investigator who keeps going back to that flat of Mrs. Chapman. And he keeps asking more questions. And he then finally gains entry and he finds a trunk. The trunk gets opened. And inside that trunk, there is a woman's body with her face smashed in. Poirot and Japp are called upon the scene, and what Poirot notices, besides the smell...
Can I just pull out, because I think it's such a great example of how Christie is not a cozy writer, which is a stereotype we're always pushing against. This is what Christie writes when Poirot at least sees her body. The face had been battered out of all recognizable shape. Add to that the natural process of decomposition, and it was no wonder that both men looked a shade pea green as they turned away. Obviously, she could have been a lot more graphic in her detail, but she's not shying away from it either. We understand how disgusting the body is in that trunk.
Oh,
it's not pretty.
No, it's not good. Even despite the fact that he's a little bit green, Poirot notices... Guess what he notices? The buckled shoes.
He notices so many things on these shoes. So let's talk a little bit about some shoes here in Mrs. Chapman's flat. So he notices her, quote, shabby buckled shoes. Of course, then, due to the fact that this corpse with its face smashed in has on Miss Sainsbury Seal's clothes and shoes, it's nearly immediately identified Poirot as being Miss Sainsbury Seal. He, at one point, tests how one of the shoes fits on the corpse's foot, and notes without explaining any further that it's a tight fit. Let's note that odd moment within this sequence. But why her face is bashed in is anyone's guess, given that, this corpse was just left to rot, literally, in this flat. And there's no trace of Mrs. Chapman, but Poirot, of course, doesn't miss the opportunity to do a little shoe snooping in this living space as well, and notes that Mrs. Chapman takes a size 5 in shoes. Great. Wonderful. This all seems pretty straightforward until they verify the dead woman's identity through her dental records. And of course, those would be dental records at Morley, since that is Miss Sainsbury Seal's dentist. And you know what? The dead woman seemingly wearing Miss Sainsbury Seal's clothing is in fact Mrs. Chapman, because the dental records do not match up with Miss Sainsbury Seal. They match up with Mrs. Chapman, who also just happens to go to Morley as her dentist. Convenient.
Right. So at this point...
Here's where things start getting really ridiculous, by the way.
Yeah.
This is where things actually get insane, believe it or not.
Yeah. So at this point, during all of this blunt, so he gets Poirot to basically come down to his country house because he's now had an attempt made on his life, leaving a government meeting. And that attempt is stopped by none other than Howard Rakes, although I believe this is only known to Poirot and not to Blunt. But Poirot heads down to the country estate where the house dynamics are, let's just say, incredibly foul. Jane and her mother, Mrs. Oliveira, are really angry that Poirot is there, and they're even more irritated at having to deal with another family cousin, Helen Montresor. This poor woman has the nerve of getting to live in the garden cottage and eating dinner at the big house with them, even though she's some destitute relation in like a charity case, as though the Oliveiras have any room to say anything, given the only reason they are there is trying to get money from Alistair Blunt.
So Poirot, when he goes down there, recognizes the new gardener, who is none other than our favorite fascist paramour, Frank Carter. And he had previously told Gladys that he had been given a high-paying secretarial job out of town. He did not say that he was doing a little bit of gardening work for the Blunts. Later, while Poirot is having a garden walk and talking about the danger that Mr. Blunt is in, a gun goes off and almost shoots Blunt until the assailant is caught, gun in hand, by Howard Rakes, because Howard Rakes is there since he is also a paramour of Jane Oliveira. And the man who seems to have been doing the shooting is Frank Carter, not surprisingly. He was trimming the hedges, and he says he had nothing to do with it, that the gun was sort of thrown in his general direction, and he picked it up, and that's why he was holding it.
But it's literally holding a smoking gun.
The other thing, which is not so good for him, is that this gun is the twin of the gun used to kill Morley. So I'm relieved to say, are at the end of the world as it appears to be, which is that Frank Carter seems to have done it. He is presented as a bad lot, as we've mentioned. Case solved, except...
There is a world as it actually is.
Oh, yes, there is.
For all the plot here, there aren't really very many clues.
No.
All the clues are basically related to each other, I would say.
The clues are about really just one very specific concept, which we've talked about ad nauseum already on this podcast before. It's not going to come as a surprise, but take it away, Catherine.
What is clue number one, Kemper? What is one of our cardinal rules? If someone talks about being an actor or an actress, you had better pay attention. It is never a throwaway. And it's not a throwaway here. So our deduction is that Mabel Sainsbury Seal is not who she says she is, or if she is, then something surrounding her circumstance right now is very wrong.
And now, so we have technically 4 clues, all of them having to do with Mabel Sainsbury Seal, and all getting to a significant deduction overall. So I just want to point that out, that these are all related to each other and moving very gradually in one direction and toward one big reveal. So clue number 2 is Miss Sainsbury Seal's shoes. We mentioned that there are these different size shoes in the hotel room. Poirot does say maybe it's corns or vanity, but given that she has mentioned she is an actor, that there's some actor business going on here, we should deduce that these are probably a costume of some sort. Someone else is wearing her shoes. That other person probably has different size feet. This is most likely the reason why there are 2 different sizes of shoes in her hotel room. Then very much related to that clue, this is kind of the really key clue here, and I think the one that most people pull out of 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe in general, because it's there in the title.
Right.
And that has to do with the quality of the shoes. We're told when Poirot meets Miss Sainsbury Seal outside the dentist at the beginning of the book that she is wearing a new buckled shoe. But then when Poirot sees ostensibly it's that same shoe on her dead body, the shoe is, quote, shabby. But, and we would understand if this timeline is not clear in our summary or even upon reading the novel, but if you go back and work it out, within the timeline here, Miss Sainsbury Seal actually visited Mrs. Chapman on the evening of the same day that Poirot first saw her outside the dentist. So the deduction here is that shoes don't go from looking new to looking shabby or worn in a day. That means there are 2 pairs of buckled shoes here, which is more evidence of costuming. And there's even a corollary to this clue having to do with the quality of stockings, because when Poirot meets Miss Sainsbury Seal in the morning, it is noted that her stockings are good quality. And then when he views them in the hotel room, they are cheap. So that would also indicate that Poirot saw 2 different women wearing different quality stockings. So clue number 4. Oh, did you think that I was done talking about Miss Sainsbury Seal's stockings?
I mean,
no.
one could have hoped, but you and Poirot both have the same interest in women's stockings, apparently. A new thing, I guess. I was unaware.
So, given the fact that Poirot found 10-inch stockings in Miss Sainsbury Seal's room, that would indicate to readers, I would argue nowhere, that she, of course, has to wear a size 6 shoe. But of course, you have a 10-inch stocking. That means it's a size 6 UK shoe in 1940, I suppose. Okay, Agatha. So that is a deduction that a very knowledgeable reader could make. And to be fair, I think a contemporary reader may have been more able to make that because stockings were also a larger part of everyone's life back then. But as we noted before, we are told that Mrs. Chapman definitely wears a size 5 shoe. But then remember that odd little moment when Poirot tested the shoe worn on the corpse. It was noted that it was a tight fit. So the deduction here is that the body that the dental records say is Mrs. Chapman dressed in Miss Sainsbury Seal's clothes, including her shoes, can't be Mrs. Chapman, because if it was, then the shoe would be loose. Because Mrs. Chapman wears a size 5 and Miss Sainsbury Seal wears a 6 due to that stocking size. We know that. So there's something weird going on here with the dental records. And that leads us to our final and most ingenious clue. This is the one that I personally really enjoy.
It's the bashed-in face of Mrs. Chapman. Her face was so destroyed, she was only identifiable based on the dental records. But those records said she was Mrs. Chapman, whereas our previous clues prove she couldn't have been. There's a deduction here, which is that the face bashing is a double bluff.
Love a double bluff.
Right. The corpse, one would normally assume, based on the clothing, was Miss Sainsbury Seal, was bashed in to conceal the fact that it was in fact Miss Sainsbury Seal, which does that not make any sense? Well, it does make sense if you realize the dental records were switched.
Right. We are at the end of our clues, and while that does get us to a significant overall deduction, which explains why Mr. Morley, the poor dentist, had to be murdered, i.e. the dental records couldn't be switched with the dentist being there in his office and even probably realizing, like, hey, wait a second, something's up here, even after the fact that they were switched, you will notice that does not really tell us what
is going on at all.
It doesn't tell us who killed Mr. Morley, doesn't tell us who killed Mr. Ambriotis. It doesn't explain the whole Mabel Sainsbury Seal business. That is because the clues just don't get us there in this puzzle mystery. I would argue that this puzzle mystery is remarkably incomplete for Christie, because we just have to have the ending and the resolution explained to us in a grand denouement between Poirot and the murderer. This is another case in which we don't have everyone assembled here. This is Poirot with one person.
Right. So grand is not perhaps the right word. Long-winded would be closer. Because the denouement here is 20 pages.
Because it's so complicated, and it just has to be spoon-fed to us as readers, because there's just no way of getting there. Even from what are admittedly ingenious and pleasing clues, it's half a puzzle mystery.
Before we get to that room, the only thing that we get before is that Poirot visits Frank Carter in prison, and he forces him to admit, as Poirot insists, the one thing that acquits him. And it's that Carter was, in fact, at Morley's office at the exact time of Morley's death. He had gone there to confront Morley, and he had been seen by Morley's maid, and who tells Poirot this after she's moved to the country with the grenadier.
She's becoming quite a good cook, though, apparently, so I think she'll be okay. It is classic puzzle mystery Christie in that what Carter tells Poirot proves that Morley was actually murdered a lot earlier than we had thought, and that ends up being very significant because, and let's just let the cat out of the bag here since it's so difficult to explain anyway, Alistair Blunt, would-be intended victim, is in fact the murderer.
A multiple murderer.
Alistair Blunt was a striving financier who was married to a struggling actress named Gerda, and he was still married to Gerda when he met and fell in like with Rebecca Arnholt. She's basically a fake Rothschild.
A banking dynasty.
Yeah, she comes from a banking dynasty, so he worked for her family firm. She was much older than him, but they had a shared spirit, and they easily made even more money than ever. So they led a pretty happy life together until she abruptly died, and then he, of course, inherited everything from her and continued to grow, expand his control over British banking. There's only one little problem, which is that Alistair Blunt is a bigamist, because Gerda never died.
Well, yeah, and he didn't divorce Gerda.
And who is Gerda? Helen Montresor, that cousin who is living at his estate. And as it turns out, Gerda is actually one other person who we've met in this story. Let's talk about that, Catherine.
Yeah, so their life, Helen Montresor and Alistair Blunt, their life is fine and dandy until Mabel Sainsbury Seal returns from India and her charitable work. And she goes to the dentist, and outside of the dentist, she sees Alistair Blunt. She doesn't know him as the titan of British finance. She does know him because she had once been close to his wife. This is exactly the same story that Jane tells Poirot earlier, that this woman is telling this crazy story. But she wasn't telling a crazy story. She was close to his wife. It's just that she meant his first and still alive wife, Gerda. Because guess what? They were actresses together when they were young. And she also mentions this fact, like just as a weird coincidence, to her new travel buddy, Embariotis. She's just telling her new friend this story. But we know that he is a notorious spy and blackmailer, and he puts the pieces together. And he realizes now that he could blackmail one of the most powerful men in England, if not the West.
So, Gerda reconnects with Mabel in the flat of Mrs. Chapman, except Mabel doesn't visit twice. And this is because Gerda, one of her other impersonations was as Mrs. Chapman. So Gerda was playing another role here, dressing up as Mrs. Chapman. Mabel Sainsbury Seal just visited the first time, and that's when she was killed. So much, days, if not weeks, earlier. Forgive me because the timeline is a little fuzzy in my head. I don't know if it's days or weeks, but a significant amount of time earlier when she first visited, she's killed. Her face is bashed in and she's hidden in that trunk. Gerda then takes over Mabel's hotel room, moves to a different hotel because it would be much easier to play at being Mabel among strangers.
People who didn't already know you as Mabel.
Exactly. And she then stores some of her more elegant nighttime shoes in there, which are a size smaller than the real Mabel's. She books a dental appointment as Mabel. And then she and her husband send a telegram sending away Gladys, the receptionist, because Gladys would know that this was not the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal. They make sure to book this appointment at the same time as Mr. Embariotis and Mr. Blunt's appointments. How they actually are able to pull off, knowing when his appointment is and making sure that it is calibrated just so within the schedule of appointments that morning is one of the glaring weaknesses of this novel. But they then murder Morley, the dentist, earlier than is thought to be the time of his death, because he is murdered actually during Mr. Blunt's appointment, not after Mr. Embariotis' appointment, as had been previously hypothesized. And that's why Frank Carter's testimony as to timing is so key. So they murder Morley, they shoot him, they drag his body into his office since he can't be sitting in his appointment room by the dentist chair. They then switch Mabel's dental records with Gerda's as Mrs. Chapman, since she, as Mrs. Chapman, has been going to Mr. Morley, the dentist. Then Blunt, with presumably a mask over his face.
It's also implied by Poirot that nobody in England really knows what Blunt looks like. They just know his name. He's not he's not a social man. He doesn't go to social functions. He's a homebody. So it's implied that, even perhaps somebody like Embariotis might not actually know what Mr. Blunt looks like.
Right. And I think that's more believable in 1940. There's no Instagram. People aren't photographed at the click of a button. That is a nit that many people pick within this puzzle mystery. I don't. I think that is the least of this mystery's problems.
there are other nits to pick. I think that you would not necessarily identify somebody in a place where you did not expect to see them. I like that he's very proud of the fact that he was a good fake dentist.
Yeah. So he overinjects Embariotis with the anesthesia. And then what happens next?
Well, they use Frank Carter as an extremely convenient fall guy, and then they hire him under the pretense of doing work for the government. So he really does think he's doing some sort of minor grade spycraft. He's supposed to be keeping an eye over things, the Blunt estate. And then this is also super stupid, I'm sorry to say. But the gun that almost shoots Blunt is in fact rigged to go off when Carter is hedge trimming. So it looks like he's caught with a smoking gun because he really is, because it then falls from the hedge, even though it doesn't really make sense that it would be there at exactly the same moment they were walking by. And also, you would run the risk of actually shooting someone.
Yeah, and also Rakes is conveniently there so he can run onto the scene and identify the fact that he sees Carter with the gun. But if Rakes hadn't been there, couldn't Carter have just run away? That whole scenario is absurd.
It doesn't even make sense from any standpoint.
So basically the case is solved because Poirot, as we've said, is a leg/ankle man, and he notices all this funny business with shoes and stockings. And we realize that Morley is only killed so that the dental records can be swapped. And Ambariotis, of course, is poisoned because he was a blackmailer. And Mabel Sainsbury Seal was killed for what she knew. Oh, yes, there is a little coda as well, just in case you were wondering within this confusion. Mr. Barnes, the one who had been helping out and urging on Poirot this whole time, he is actually the incredibly high-level British spy, Albert Chapman. So he knew all along that there never was a Mrs. Chapman, and that had to be an impersonation and was part of the funny business going on here. That is where we end.
Yeah.
All right, before we get into our rankings on this one, let's talk briefly about the only adaptation, which is the David Suchet adaptation. So this was episode 3 in season/series 4. We're in 1992 here, so pretty early. Christopher Eccleston actually plays Frank Carter, and in his book, David Suchet claims to have known back then that he was going to be a future star. I think in general, it acquits itself pretty well for what is such a confusing and convoluted novel. There's some
they streamline it quite well.
Yeah, there's no Howard Rakes. There's no Mr. Barnes the spy. There's no Riley, the dentist partner. The one thing that it does do, which confuses things more, is that in the novel as written, we never actually meet the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal.
No.
The Mabel who Poirot meets at the dentist is, of course, Gerda pretending to be Mabel. That's why we have all these doubles of shoes and stockings and whatnot.
Right.
In the adaptation, there are 2 visits to the dentist. Poirot meets the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal at the dentist in the first appointment, and then a little bit after that, he then meets the fake Mabel Sainsbury Seal also at the dentist, so that is pure coincidence that Poirot happened to book at the same time that the fake Mabel Sainsbury Seal did for the second appointment, and that the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal was there the first time. And what that also does is that it creates the situation for the viewer where we saw one actress play the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal, and then we see the second actress play the fake one. And I mean, it's hard for me to judge because I was looking for it and I was waiting for them to look different, but they look really different.
Mm-hmm.
That's a problem.
Yeah, it's clever that we never meet the real one in the book. It works better, and there's no real reason why they have to do that in the adaptation, right?
I was thinking about that too, and the only thing I could come up with is that I think it's the usual issue of let's try to get Poirot into the story earlier so that we don't have to tell all of this in retrospect.
But he's in it in the first page.
He's in the first page in the novel, but there's a lot of
backstory. Is that what we're, yeah, right.
You know? So I think they were trying to bring up the backstory and just insert him into all of the hullabaloo around the real Mabel Sainsbury Seal, but it doesn't really work, and I think they probably just should have stuck to the sequencing in the novel. And then because this is a Japp Poirot novel, there's great use of Philip Jackson. Poirot actually comes to Japp's house unannounced, and there's a really funny moment when you can see Japp, he's pruning his bushes outside.
Are you receiving visitors, mon ami?
Good heavens. Poirot.
Chief Inspector?
What on earth brings you to Isleworth on a Sunday afternoon?
Business? What else?
Oh, you better come inside and have a cup of tea.
Thank you.
And he invites Poirot in, but he looks around at his neighbors to see if anyone has seen, like, the funny little European man going into his house. You can tell he's, like, a little bit, not embarrassed, but just he knows that people are going to note it.
he should be honored.
Do you take sugar, Poirot?
Do you have perhaps a tisane?
Come off it, Poirot. This is Isleworth, you know, not Wanley Pan.
It is an excellent Japp novel, and it happens to be the last novel in which Japp appears, which is always surprising since we're so used to Japp being everywhere within the Suchet series. But this is the last novel where we see Inspector Japp. The adaptation opens on India in 1925, so about 10 years, 10 or 11 years before the main action. And that is showing your hand a little bit. But honestly, this is such a confusing solution that I think showing your hand is not a bad thing.
Well, in a weird way, it's not that confusing of a solution, right? A guy is a bigamist. He marries another woman to get ahead. He's found out, so he has to arrange a way to kill the witnesses. That's essentially what the plot of this is.
That's what the plot of it is, and let's just go right into rankings, because what drives me crazy, though, about this is that, yes, it's very simple. Why would Alistair Blunt and his first wife have to create this confusion with,
wouldn't.
They wouldn't. Is this body Mabel
No.
Sainsbury Seal or Mrs. Chapman? It makes no sense. There are such simpler ways of killing these people than doing it through the dentist and doing all this dental record nonsense.
Right. And so my immediate reaction to this is, are the mechanics of this very clever? Yes, of course they are. They're very clever. Everything actually does work out. But is it necessary? No. And so we talk about mechanics and credibility, and I would just say the credibility on this is so low.
I 100% agree with you. We talk about how the convolution issue is endemic to the puzzle mystery as a subgenre of crime fiction, but it can be done more or less convincingly. And while I'm absolutely willing to forgive, for example, Death on the Nile, some of that same issue, here it's particularly egregious. But I would actually argue that I don't think the plot mechanics are working because they don't get us there. The plot mechanics don't even get us close to a solution. As I said, I think this is half a puzzle mystery. We have to have this thing explained to us in a long-winded 20-page denouement where Poirot just tells the murderer how he did it. That's not good.
I agree. But, the ultimate explanation makes sense.
The explanation makes sense, but as a puzzle mystery that's supposed to be giving the reader agency and the ability to solve the mystery on her own, it fails because the mystery does have to be explained to the reader. And if it were a thriller, if it were a straight-up Christie thriller, then obviously when we're talking about quote-unquote plot mechanics, we're talking about something different because it's not functioning as a puzzle mystery. But this is presented as a puzzle mystery. It's just not one that's working completely. It just doesn't get us there. And I find that really unsatisfying and problematic. And interestingly, Christie herself may have agreed with me because in Laura Thompson's biography of Christie, which we've referenced before, it is quite excellent. She mentions that Christie's longtime agent, Edmund Cork, wrote to her about One Two Buckle My Shoe, "I'm afraid I don't like this book quite as much as some of the others," and that Christie responded with, "I agree with you about it. Not one of my best." So I think for me, it impinges on both plot mechanics and plot credibility. I agree with you that I think plot credibility is the bigger issue because it's just Alistair Blunt is an intelligent man. Why he would go through the ridiculousness of tying these victims together, Mabel Sainsbury Seal and Barriotis, in the dentist's office, and then we're never given a satisfying explanation as to why this elaborate double bluff is necessary. Why is it so important that Mabel Sainsbury Seal's body be concealed in this flat for so long? I don't really see a reason why her dead body couldn't have been discovered the same time Mr. Ambariotis's was. I actually have to mention, we have another reference point that unfortunately we're only going to be able to use for a couple of novels, but there's this wonderful book that John Goddard wrote called Agatha Christie's Golden Age, an analysis of Poirot's Golden Age puzzles, where he goes through in all of the Christie's Poirot mysteries from Mysterious Affair at Styles all the way to Five Little Pigs. So I wish that we had found out about this book earlier because we only have a couple more novels that he discusses, but he goes through in painstaking detail, similar to what we do, and discusses them. And he's the one that really made the point that while the double bluff is really clever and pleasing, it's not necessary. He also touches on the issue of those dental appointments because timing is so key to the solving of this puzzle mystery, in that Alistair Blunt had an appointment followed immediately by Miss Sainsbury Seal, who, of course, was the fake Miss Sainsbury Seal. That was Gerda. And then Mr. Ambariotis had an appointment immediately after that. Those 3 appointments have to be sequenced perfectly for the murder of Morley and then Ambariotis to have been pulled off, but it's unclear how they were able to sequence it so perfectly since, of course, Mr. Ambariotis' appointment was made independent of theirs. He is one of the murder victims. And Goddard also takes this a step further, all of the issues surrounding the dental hijinks here, writing, readers may also wonder how Blunt acquired sufficient dental knowledge to perform effectively, particularly when injecting into the gum and judging the amount of the overdose. Moreover, the plan was risky because Alfred, that was the boy who took in appointments, might have entered the surgery with the false Miss Sainsbury Seal and noticed the body or seen that Morley was not at the basin. And most damning of all, I think, is that we know Riley, the dentist's partner, just moseyed on into the office and said everything seemed fine to him. He saw Morley, no big deal. What if he had moseyed on in 10 minutes later after Morley had been shot, or at any point thereafter before Morley's body had been found? They just got really lucky, and that's not very satisfying. What I suspect, and this is coming from Curran's discussion of 1, 2, Buckle My Shoe from his analysis of her notebooks, is that the germ of this idea was that she wanted to do something around a dentist, where the switching of dental records was key to solving the mystery. And it sort of is, but it's not. And it's a great idea. It's a wonderful idea.
Right,
I just don't think she crafted the mystery that truly hinges on that.
And I think that's inherently the big problem here, is that if you start pulling off what's unnecessary, you're not left with a whole lot, and you're still not getting a solution.
Right. You're left with a pleasing double bluff scenario, but that doesn't give you your solution. And other than that, everything else is just smoke. You know, I don't think I come down as low on it as I sound like I would given this, because I do think that the puzzle mystery elements that are there are pleasing. What I was thinking was a 6 for plot mechanics and a 4 for plot credibility. Are you okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to series-long characters, which I think is where this book does the best.
Yeah. We get really good Poirot here and really good Japp.
Yeah, I would say in particular it's Japp, and maybe I'm just feeling emotional about him since I know it's the last time we're going to see Japp in novel form, but we get lots of good Japp-Poirot interaction. That little bit about the stockings where he says, "You're not valuing for probate, old boy," I very much appreciated. Japp used the word napoo, which I didn't even know what it meant, nor did Poirot. Poirot's like, okay. I love Britishisms that have to do with anglicized French. There's like so much more crossover in British English with French than in American English. So that is a modification of il n'y en a plus, i.e. there is no more. It means like something is done. When he's saying the investigation, he's like, it's napoo. Poirot, it's over. It's done. I have to note this as the Christie nerds that we are, and there are some listeners who will appreciate this. We get confirmation that time moves in the Poirot-verse the same as in our world, since in this novel, Japp references having known Poirot, quote, a long time, 20 years? Something like that. Because this is 1940, and we saw them first in The Mysterious Affair at Styles. However, maybe what I just said is actually not true, because in Styles, Japp refers to the year that he and Poirot first met and worked together, which was 1904. So, does time really move more slowly in the Poirot verse than in our world, or did Christie just forget that she said that in Styles? I think she might have just forgotten.
You know, it's a little bit like And Then There Were None, where General MacArthur says something is 30 years ago, and then if you pause to think about it, the reaction is, well, what war would you have been fighting?
Let's never forget the Joyce/Joan Lempriere issue. Where we can trust that Christie is paying attention is the puzzle mystery aspect of it, right? Like she is laying in the clues. She's laying, except perhaps in this novel, but she's laying in the clues. She's got her eye on the ball. But I think sometimes when it comes to these little nitpicky continuity issues, these things fall by the wayside. And shame on her editors, because that's partially what an editor is for. I also do just want to highlight that sequence between Poirot and Frank Carter, when he's in prison and he goes to him. It's really good. And it goes to the core of who Poirot is, because he really loathes Frank Carter. And this is where we should remind ourselves of when this book is being written. Carter's a fascist, and it's the beginning of World War II, and Poirot has no respect for him. But what he does have respect for is the truth, and also for every individual's right to not be falsely accused and convicted of something. He really forces the issue with Frank Carter and ultimately saves him, and it's because he's a man of principle. And there's generally a lot of that. There are conversations that he has with Blunt as well, because Alistair Blunt certainly believes that country is more important than any individual, and Poirot, as always, says it is each individual's person and their right to live that I am concerned with. It's good Poirot stuff.
It is, although interestingly, we see Poirot, though, slightly hesitant about what he has to do with Alistair Blunt, because at some level, Poirot kind of agrees with where Blunt stands on order.
Yeah, I mean, it's the same struggle that he has with Frank Carter. He doesn't want to help Frank Carter, and he does want to help Alistair Blunt. Yeah, so I think we agreed on a 7 for series-long characters.
Yeah.
And then book-specific characters, I think this book does not really do that well, especially coming off of Sad Cypress and Then There Were None. Jane Oliveira is described as deeply tanned. So very unusual for a woman to be tanned as opposed to a man in a Christie novel.
I mean, it's really pretty low. I mean, I would say a 5 or a 6.
Yeah, I came out on a 5 on this. I think in a weird way that Frank Carter, Howard Rakes, and Alistair Blunt as these symbols of differing political viewpoints, that's probably the strongest character work that's being done here. But even that is not particularly strong, just from a pure character.
No, not from a thematic standpoint.
From a thematic standpoint, right. So let's just go right into setting and tone. I mean, as a political book, people generally think of Christie as getting more political in a bad way as she got older, because she got crotchety and she got, even more conservative, and we'll get there. And that certainly, I think, is a valid criticism of her. This is an early, overtly political book, and I think it's a little bit more nuanced than she is usually given credit for. There are a number of diverging viewpoints, and all of them are kind of loathsome in a weird way.
They all are. No, they all are.
And she's not taking sides. She's not making it easy.
Well, the only side that would be taken is that Blunt's version of governance is the right one. It just is unfortunate that he's a craven murderer.
Right. And that's why she'll never take that side. So it's right. I'm not saying that I like the politicism of this book, or that I think it's done particularly well when compared to the way that these issues can be handled in other novels outside the mystery genre, or perhaps even within other mystery novels that aren't Christie. But I think when we're looking at it in terms of it's probably one of the better of the overtly political novels. Because what it's really about is the inherent corrupting influence of political ideology itself, no matter where on the spectrum that ideology may fall, be it far to the left, a la Howard Rakes, far to the right, a la Frank Carter, or even something perceived to be more middle of the road, a la Alistair Blunt. Over time, with the accretion of power on the part of anyone, not just the Howard Rakeses and Frank Carters of the world, but even the Alistair Blunts of the world, that power will corrupt. She's grappling with some weighty issues, not entirely successfully, but not entirely unsuccessfully either.
It's more than we see often attempted.
And we get this final moment where Poirot addresses Jane Oliveira and Howard Rakes, who are together as a couple, and again, he's our leftist radical, and this is what Poirot says. He says, "The world is yours, the new heaven and the new earth. In your new world, my children, let there be freedom and let there be pity. That is all I ask." To me, it feels like, and again, this is why I say we can tell this is written in wartime. It's like Christine, she knows the writing on the wall. She knows that there is upheaval, and she's not happy about it, but she's at least trying to make the point that by holding on to, I think, some of these kind of bedrock principles, that's the best we have. Let's at least think about truth and kindness. And it's cheesy, but it is meaningful. And I have to say, and I think you mentioned this first, Catherine, when we were talking about this book, but I think that the politics of this resonates more certainly with me than it would if I were reading this even 3 years ago. I just think we're right now in a time of a lot of political upheaval, and Christie's message on that was not lost on me, and I didn't laugh at it. I get it.
No, I didn't. And I mean, I think that we certainly understand the political divide currently happening in the United States intimately. And I think that a lot of our listeners, I think that our friends in the UK certainly understand what starts happening when you start pulling at the seams of the center. The thematics of it are essentially about the center not holding. It makes a lot of sense in terms of Christie, and I think it's resonant in an interesting way in 2018, in a way that I think a lot of us perhaps wish weren't the case.
Right. So all that being said, I would be giving the setting and the tone a fairly high score. However, I have one final bone to pick with this poor novel before I am done with it, and that is the nursery rhyme framing. And I would like to quote our friend John Curran on this because I think he summed it up quite well. He writes, "The only aspect of this novel that does not ring true is, ironically, the use of the nursery rhyme. It is strained and unconvincing, and apart from the all-important shoe buckle, the rhyme has little or no significance other than providing chapter titles." I totally agree, and there are so many moments in this book where I cringed because you could feel Christie trying to shoehorn different chapters into some sort of thematic resonance with what the title was from the nursery rhyme. Like, she refers to Mrs. Oliveira as a hen. It's just silly and needless, and we saw it done so well in And Then There Were None because it was a creepy nursery rhyme, and it really resonated just perfectly. It really doesn't work for me, and it's pervasive.
It's not ideal. I mean, I don't think that I feel the need to dock points for it.
Where do you come out on setting a tone?
I thought a 7.
Would you be willing to do a 6?
I suppose I could do a 6.
Okay. We both have 0 deductions for Stuck in Its Time because there are exactly 2 offensive references. There's an N-word, and it is Mr. Frank Carter who says it, so that is believable.
Definitely believable.
And I believe that there is a reference to Rebecca Arnholt being a, quote, notorious Jewess, end quote. But that, too, is also in reference to Frank Carter. So they both are surrounding a character who is clearly reprehensible and not in any way condoned by Christie herself. So absolutely zero deductions, which for a very of its time political novel, there were certainly a lot of traps she did not fall into in this novel.
Right.
So that gives us a grand total of 6 plus 4 plus 7 plus 5 plus 6 minus 0, 28 points, putting 1-2 Buckle My Shoe in 13th place, right behind Lord Edward Dies and in front of Death in the Clouds. Technically, we've got a bit of a tie here. We have a number of novels we've ranked at 28 points. So directly below 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, we have Death in the Clouds, The Secret Adversary, and The Man in the Brown Suit. But we believe that 1-2 Buckle My Shoe is slightly superior to Death in the Clouds. That's a tough call.
If you all believe Death in the Clouds is a superior novel, we could probably be convinced.
We would love to hear if there are any passionate advocates for Death in the Clouds over 1-2 Buckle My Shoe. We would love to hear from you. On that note, that is 1-2 Buckle My Shoe, our latest Poirot novel. Join us next week for a special anniversary episode. We officially turned 2 years old on the birthday of Agatha Christie, of course, September 15th. So we are due for an episode discussing the current state of our rankings. We did this last year, and it helped give our overall rankings a sense of coherence. So we plan on doing that every year that we are engaging in this crazy project of ours. That will be the subject of discussion next week. And then our next novel a couple of weeks from now will be Evil Under the Sun, another Poirot. Very excited for that. And in the meantime, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at allaboutthedame@gmail.com or find us on Twitter at allaboutthedame. You can find Catherine at Brobcat. We are on Instagram at allaboutagatha, and our Facebook page is All About Agatha. And please take a moment to rate and review us. It really helps other people find the podcast. And we will see you next time. Bye.
Bye.